Imagine being a father, a protector, someone your kids depend on, and then, in the blink of an eye, you destroy everything. Chad Doerman, a father who murdered his 3 sons, thought he could escape the consequences, but what he didn't know was that his wife, the one person he never expected, would turn him in. This is a story of rage, betrayal, and an unimaginable crime. Stay with us to uncover the shocking twists in this real-life case that will leave you speechless until the very end. The air was thick with tension. Chad Doerman sat in his truck. The engine hummed softly, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. His eyes flickered to the house in the distance. A small, quiet house that once held so much warmth. Now it seemed like a prison. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon. A cool breeze brushed against his face, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with darker thoughts. Thoughts he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. The plan had been simple. He would end it all tonight. He would erase the reminders of his past. The kids who caused him nothing but frustration. And the woman who betrayed him. He had always told himself it was for the best. He was doing them a favor that would set everyone free. The house loomed ahead, silent. As he approached the front door, he felt his chest tighten. He pushed open the door with an eerie quietness. No one would hear him. No one would stop him. The kids were upstairs. He knew their routine. They were waiting. His pulse quickened as he crept up the stairs, one step at a time. The house was still, too still. His breathing was shallow. A sense of dread hung in the air, thick like smoke. His hand trembled as it reached for the door. The silence was deafening. In the room, his sons lay unaware. They never saw it coming. Their faces were serene, innocent. Chad took a breath, a deep, shaky breath. The finality of the moment pressed down on him. But then something changed. The door opened behind him. He turned, startled. There she was, his wife, standing there, eyes wide, filled with disbelief. Her mouth trembled as she took a step forward. Her voice, barely a whisper, broke the stillness. You're not serious." His heart pounded in his ears. He didn't want to do it anymore. But it was too late. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. But the moment was interrupted. The sound of sirens filled the air. Chad froze, his stomach sinking. He glanced back to his wife, who stood there, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice steady but cold. "You've gone too far, Chad." The realization hit him like a cold wave. His wife had turned him in. He had thought she was still on his side. But she wasn't. And now, there was no escape. The weight of his actions crashed down on him. He was trapped. All the planning, all the lies, had been for nothing. His world was unraveling. The sirens grew louder. The door burst open. And Chad Doerman's fate was sealed. The door slammed open with force. A flood of flashing lights poured into the house. The sound of footsteps, heavy and urgent, echoed through the hallway. Chad's breath hitched. His heart slammed against his chest. His knees felt weak, like they might buckle under the weight of the moment. The officers stormed inside, their eyes scanning the room with cold precision. Chad was frozen. There was no escape now. No way out of this. His wife stood behind him, her expression unreadable. She hadn't moved an inch. Her eyes locked on him, unblinking. Her betrayal stung worse than any blow. The officers grabbed his arms, pulling him away from the room. He didn't resist. He couldn't. His mind was a fog of disbelief and regret. His eyes darted toward the stairs, but he couldn't look away for long. He knew what he had done. The pain in his chest grew sharper, more real with every passing second. The voices of the officers were distant, muffled, as though coming from another world. But one phrase cut through the haze. "You're under arrest for the murder of your sons." The words hit like a physical blow. They were final. There was no turning back now. Chad's legs were shaky as he was pulled outside. The flashing lights outside the house felt like an alien invasion. The air was cold. Too cold. He had no idea where he was, what was happening. But one thing was clear. His wife had watched him as he killed their children. She hadn't stopped him. Instead, she had let him dig his own grave. And now, she was watching him crumble under the weight of his actions. She hadn't moved to help him. She hadn't screamed. No, she'd waited for this moment. The police car's doors slammed shut. Chad's world spun faster. His head felt heavy. The cuffs around his wrists were tight, biting into his skin. The truck that had once carried him to his plan now seemed like a distant memory. The house, the kids, everything was gone. The sirens wailed as they pulled away from the scene. And Chad Doerman knew, deep down, he had lost everything. But there was no time for reflection. The walls of the car felt like they were closing in on him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Not yet. Not until the trial. But one thing was certain now. His wife had turned him in. And there was no way back. The car rattled along the dark streets, the sirens still wailing in the distance. Chad's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and regret. The world outside blurred, indistinct. All he could focus on was the cold, unyielding reality. His thoughts circled back to her. His wife. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't begged him to stop. Instead, she had watched. She had let him do it, let him destroy their family. And now she was the one who had brought him down. The pain of betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever known. The car's engine hummed a rhythm that seemed to mock his thoughts. There was no escape from this. No way out. They arrived at the station, the flashing lights now a constant blur of red and blue. Chad was pulled from the car and led into the building. His legs felt like jelly, his head heavy with guilt and disbelief. His hands were still shackled behind his back. The officers didn't speak to him. They didn't need to. His fate was sealed. He was no longer the man he had been just hours ago. Everything had changed. They sat him in a small room. The walls were bare, cold, sterile. A single light bulb flickered overhead. Chad's eyes darted around, but there was no comfort to be found in the room. He was alone with his thoughts, and the weight of what he had done. A voice suddenly cut through the silence. "Chad, we know what happened." The detective's voice was calm, methodical. Chad didn't respond. What was there to say? The detective continued, his tone sharp. "You murdered your 3 sons. Cold-blooded. In your own home." Chad's chest tightened. The words felt like a slap. He wanted to scream, to argue, to deny it. But he couldn't. He couldn't change what had already happened. The detective leaned in, his eyes hard and unflinching. "Your wife turned you in. She gave us everything we needed." Chad's heart stopped. His mind screamed in disbelief. She had turned him in. The shock of it hit him harder than anything he had ever felt. The woman he had once loved had condemned him to this. The detective stood up, signaling the end of the interrogation. "There's no way out, Chad. You're going to pay for this." Chad was left alone again, the silence pressing down on him. And for the first time, he realized just how far he had fallen. Everything he had done, everything he had believed in, was nothing but a lie. The door opened, and a guard stepped inside. Time was running out. Chad didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the empty chair in front of him. The world outside was still, but inside, everything was falling apart. The door creaked open again, and Chad's gaze lifted. A guard entered the room, his expression blank, as if he had seen this all before. Chad was numb. The reality of his situation seemed too much to process. His thoughts scattered, trying to make sense of it all, but there was no clarity. The guard's footsteps echoed in the sterile room. Chad's wrists burned with a cold bite of the handcuffs. The door clicked shut behind the guard. He stood silently, not bothering to speak. The minutes dragged on like hours. Chad sat still, his body stiff. The room felt smaller with every passing second. The hum of the fluorescent light above was maddening. It was the only sound in the room, aside from the beating of his heart. His chest tightened again. The weight of his crimes pressed on him, unbearable. In the silence, his mind replayed everything. The house, his son's faces, the coldness in his wife's eyes. The betrayal. He had thought he was justified. He had convinced himself he was saving them. But now? Now it all seemed so hollow. His wife had been the one who stopped him, the one who brought it all crashing down. But why? Why hadn't she stopped him before it was too late? Had she known all along what he was capable of? Chad closed his eyes, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. This was the life he had created, the life he had chosen for himself. Now there was no escape, no redemption. He could hear the faint sound of a door opening in the hallway. Footsteps approached. This time it was different. A man entered the room, a lawyer. He wore a suit, his face calm, unreadable. He sat across from Chad, his gaze piercing. Chad didn't say a word. The lawyer's voice broke the silence. "You're facing multiple charges, Chad. Murder, child endangerment. The list goes on." Chad's eyes flickered to him, but he didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere. The weight of the words hung in the air. He had done this. This was his doing. The lawyer continued, his voice methodical, detached. "There's a chance to lessen your sentence. But you need to cooperate." Chad's mouth went dry. Cooperate? How could he cooperate? There was no way to undo what he had done. There was no way to fix this. The lawyer paused, watching him closely. Chad couldn't meet his eyes. He stared at his hands, the shackles now feeling like they were part of him. "I'm not asking for a confession," the lawyer said softly. Chad's gaze lifted slightly. "But you need to understand. There's no way out of this." Chad nodded slowly, though his mind was still a blur. What had driven him to this point? What had led him to destroy everything? The lawyer's words were cold, but they made sense. Chad had already confessed to himself in his darkest moments. But saying it out loud? That was something he wasn't ready for. Not yet. For now, he could only sit there. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. The door opened again, and Chad was led away. As he passed the hallway, the walls seemed to close in around him. Every step felt like a weight on his chest. Everything he had done, everything he had lost, it was all coming down on him. There was no escape. And soon he would face the consequences. For everything. The heavy door clanged shut behind him, and Chad was once again thrust into the chaos of the holding area. The sound of muffled voices, the clatter of metal, and the constant shuffle of feet filled the air. But it all felt distant, like he was trapped in a fog. His mind was still reeling, unable to settle on any one thought. His body moved automatically, guided by the guards as they directed him down a narrow corridor. He barely noticed the other prisoners around him, their faces hollow and worn. His own face, he imagined, looked just as lost. There was nothing in this world that could undo what he had done. Nothing could erase the lives of his sons, their laughter, their warmth, their futures that had been stolen in an instant. His heart ached, but it was a deep, gnawing ache that had no release. The world outside seemed so far away now. He thought back to the moments before the police had arrived, when he had felt so sure, so confident in his choices. But now? Now, all that certainty had shattered into a million pieces. The regret seeped in like a cold draft. He was led into a small cell, the bars cold and unyielding as the guard unlocked the door. Chad stepped inside, his body stiff, his mind numb. The cell was sparse, just a cot, a small sink, and a toilet. Everything was harsh and unforgiving. He slumped down onto the cot, staring at the blank wall in front of him. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but sleep eluded him. The weight of the night was too much to bear. His mind raced, the scenes of the past hours replaying over and over again. The look on his wife's face when she had turned him in. The coldness in her eyes.
How could she do that?
Wasn't he her husband? Weren't they supposed to protect each other? But she had betrayed him. She had taken the only thing he thought he had left, his pride, his control. And now there was no coming back from it. His thoughts were interrupted by a distant sound, the clink of keys, the shuffle of feet. Footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside his cell. Chad's heart skipped a beat as a figure approached the bars. It was his wife. Her face was pale, her eyes red, like she had been crying. But there was no sympathy in her expression. Her jaw was set firm. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, looking at him with an unreadable gaze. Chad opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had never felt so small, so helpless. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You've ruined everything, Chad. You've ruined us." Her words were sharp, like knives. She didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. Chad was left alone in the cell, the door clanging shut behind him. The sound was final. It sealed him in this dark place. This was his reality now. And there was no way out.
Not now.
Not ever. The silence that followed was deafening, but it didn't bring him peace. It only deepened the isolation. The life he had once known was gone. In its place was nothing but a crushing emptiness. And there was no one left to blame but himself. The hours stretched endlessly. The silence in the cell was suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of distant murmurs or the shuffle of guards' feet outside. Chad lay back on the cot, staring up at the ceiling, but his thoughts wouldn't let him rest. His mind replayed that moment, the moment his wife had turned her back on him. The finality of her words had cut deeper than anything he had ever felt. It was as though the world had tilted beneath him, and he was falling, helpless, into a pit with no bottom. How had it come to this? How had he allowed himself to reach a point where he could take the lives of those he should have protected? His sons, their innocent faces haunted him. They had been just children, too young to understand what was happening, too pure to be caught in his web of anger and delusion. The images of their faces, the shock in their eyes as he did the unthinkable, played over and over again in his mind. He clutched his hands tightly, feeling the pressure of the metal cuffs even though they were no longer there. In his mind, he could still feel their weight. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the pain. But it wouldn't stop. The reality kept crashing in, wave after wave, suffocating him. Somewhere down the hall, someone screamed, and the sound echoed through the cold, lifeless walls of the jail. Chad didn't flinch. He had become numb to everything. His past, his choices, the consequences. It all felt distant, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. How had he not seen the signs? Hadn't his wife shown any signs of doubt? Hadn't there been moments, small cracks in the facade, when he should have noticed she was slipping away? Chad had been so consumed by his own anger, his need for control, that he had failed to see the destruction he was causing, not just to his sons, but to everything. But it was too late now. The door to his cell suddenly swung open. Chad barely reacted, his body stiffening only slightly as a figure stepped inside. It was a guard, but there was something different about the way he stood. He didn't speak at first, just watched Chad for a moment. The silence stretched, making the air thick with unspoken tension. Then the guard finally spoke, his voice low. "Your wife, she's filing for divorce." The words hit Chad like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected that. But now that it was said out loud, it felt like another nail in his coffin. His wife was done with him. She had already taken the children. And now, she was taking whatever shred of dignity he had left. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had no defense, no explanation, no way to justify what he had done. He was hollow. The guard turned and left the cell, without another word. Chad was alone again, the silence more oppressive than ever. And in that silence, he heard only one thing: the sound of his own shame. Hours bled into days. And still, there was no escape from the thoughts that trapped him in this endless cycle of regret. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the days blending together into an indistinguishable blur. The trial loomed on the horizon. He knew the verdict would be swift and unmerciful, but no punishment could ever be enough to undo the horrors he had unleashed. The guilt gnawed at him, like an animal clawing from the inside. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. The time for redemption had passed, and all that remained was the heavy weight of what he had done, and the life he had destroyed. The days blended into each other in a haze of monotony, each one bleeding into the next like an endless stretch of cold, empty hours. Chad sat in his cell, staring out at nothing. There was no escape from the suffocating reality that surrounded him. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing minute, the oppressive silence ringing in his ears. His mind refused to let go of the images. The faces of his sons, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. The sound of their voices, their laughter, forever silenced by his own hands. His heart twisted in pain, but it was a pain that had no release. His punishment had already begun. And yet, it wasn't just the guilt that held him captive. It was the isolation, the loneliness that gnawed at his soul. The world outside had abandoned him. His wife, once a partner in his life, had now become a stranger, a figure of bitterness and cold judgment. She had filed for divorce, severing the last thread that had tied them together. The truth of it settled in his chest like a stone. She wasn't just leaving him, she was erasing him, and there was nothing he could do about it. He had pushed her to this point after all. He had destroyed everything. The door to his cell creaked open again, and this time, it wasn't a guard. Chad looked up, his eyes hollow, but it was her, his wife. She stepped into the room, her expression unreadable, her face pale and drawn. The space between them felt immense, like an ocean that could never be crossed. Chad's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't expected her to come here, to see him in this place. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Her lips trembled slightly, but her gaze never wavered. "You're really here, aren't you?" she whispered, the words hanging in the air between them. Chad swallowed, but his mouth was dry. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But what could he say? What words could possibly make up for what he had done? She took a step forward, her voice steady but cold. "You took everything from me, Chad. And now, you're in here, where you belong." Her words were sharp, each one a knife twisting deeper into his already broken heart. He closed his eyes, unable to bear the weight of her gaze. She continued, her voice quiet but filled with an undeniable strength. "You think I'm here for you? That I'm here to fix this? There's nothing left to fix." Her words felt like a slap. Chad's chest tightened. He wanted to beg her to stay, to tell him everything would somehow be okay. But he knew better. There was nothing left to say. She had already made her choice. The silence stretched again, this time heavy and suffocating. She turned, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every step was a painful reminder of what had been lost. Without looking back, she walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Chad's chest tightened with an overwhelming sense of loss. The door clanged shut behind her, and he was left in the silence once more. This time it was different. There was no denial left, no illusion that things could ever be fixed. It was over. He had lost everything. And now, all he had left was the cold, unyielding walls of his cell. The silence that followed her departure felt louder than anything Chad had experienced in his life. The clanging of the door seemed to reverberate through the deepest parts of him. He sank down onto the cot, his hands shaking. The overwhelming emptiness settled around him like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. His wife's words echoed in his mind, each one sharper than the last. "You took everything from me." The words gnawed at him, but they also felt true.
He had.
He had taken everything: his sons, his family, his wife. Everything that had once mattered was now gone, slipping through his fingers like sand. Chad squeezed his eyes shut, his body trembling with the weight of his own remorse. But it wasn't just the guilt. It was the realization that there was no way back. No way to undo the irreversible damage he had caused. He had chosen this path, and now he was forced to walk it alone. He could hear the faint sounds of movement in the prison, the distant clang of metal, but they felt so far removed from him, as if he were trapped in a world of his own making, cut off from everything. His eyes flicked to the small window high on the wall, but all he saw was the shadow of the night sky. There was nothing out there, nothing left for him. The faint taste of bitterness lingered in his mouth, like the aftertaste of a memory he couldn't shake. His sons, their faces, the sound of their laughter, the sharp contrast of their innocence against the horror he had brought into their lives. Tears welled in his eyes, but they didn't fall. He didn't deserve them. He didn't deserve any of it. The moments from that night flooded back, clear as day. He could see their faces, his boys', their eyes wide with fear and confusion. He could still hear their screams, their pleas for him to stop, their hands reaching out to him. But he hadn't stopped.
No.
He had kept going. He had silenced their cries. And for what? For what reason had he done it? A broken man, lost in a world of his own making. He could feel the weight of it, the pressure that built with every thought, every memory. There was no escape from it. No place to hide. The door of the cell opened again, this time with a quick, harsh swing. Chad didn't look up. He knew who it was before the guard spoke. "The trial's coming up soon. You'll need to prepare yourself." The words were flat, but they hit him like a physical blow. The trial. The reckoning. It was time for the world to see what he had become. Time for the consequences to catch up with him. But even as the guard's footsteps faded away, even as the cell door closed once more, Chad knew the truth. The trial wouldn't bring his sons back. It wouldn't fix what he had broken. Nothing would. And as the hours continued to bleed into one another, one thing became clearer than ever. He was trapped in a nightmare with no end. And he deserved every second of it. Days passed in a blur. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing minute, each second like a reminder of the time he had lost. The weight of the trial loomed over him. The guards came and went, but Chad barely acknowledged them. He had no energy left for anger, for bitterness, or even for fear. He had nothing left to give. The idea of facing the world again, of standing before the judge, the jury, the lawyers, felt impossible. What could he say? What could he offer to explain the irreparable damage he had caused? His thoughts spiraled, turning inward, but there was no way to make sense of it. Nothing he could say would bring back the lives of his sons, their innocent faces forever etched in his memory. He lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, but his mind drifted back to the night of the murders. The chaos, the cold, twisted logic that had driven him, the adrenaline that had fueled him as he carried out the unthinkable.
But now?
Now, there was only regret. A deep, gnawing regret that consumed him, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. It was too late to undo any of it. He had made his choice, and now the consequences were here. A soft knock on the door broke through the haze of his thoughts. Chad looked up, but there was no immediate movement. The door creaked open slowly, and the guard stepped inside. Behind him stood a figure, a lawyer, tall and composed. Chad's heart sank. It was time. The trial was upon him. The lawyer introduced himself, but Chad didn't hear the words. He only heard the beating of his own heart, each thud a reminder that this was real, that this was happening. The lawyer spoke again, his voice calm, but there was something detached about it, like he was speaking to someone who no longer existed. We'll prepare your defense. There's little we can do to change the outcome, but we'll try our best. Chad didn't respond. What could he say? The lawyer continued, his words falling into the hollow space between them. There's a possibility for a plea deal. You might face life in prison, but it's better than the death penalty. Chad's chest tightened at the mention of the death penalty. It was a thought he hadn't dared entertain until now. But the truth was, it didn't matter. He deserved whatever came for him. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of Chad's silence. There's no hope of avoiding a sentence, he said, trying to be gentle, but we'll do everything we can. Chad closed his eyes, his mind a swirl of confusion, regret, and helplessness. He had thought he was saving them. He had convinced himself that what he did was justified, that his actions were necessary.
But now?
Now, all he could feel was the sharp sting of his own failure. The trial, the punishment, none of it would change anything. It was all just a final chapter in a life that had unraveled beyond repair. The lawyer stood, sensing that Chad was too far gone to respond. He nodded curtly, then turned to leave, the door closing softly behind him. Chad was left alone once more, his thoughts swirling in a dark, endless loop. The weight of his actions pressed on him like an iron shackle. There was no redemption, no escape. Only the cold, relentless march toward a future defined by his own choices. And as the days crawled toward the trial, Chad couldn't help but wonder how it would feel to face the world outside, if only for a moment. But he already knew the answer. Nothing would ever bring back what he had taken. Nothing would ever make it right. The days leading up to the trial passed slowly, dragging Chad through a haze of uncertainty and dread. Each moment felt like a punishment, each tick of the clock a reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. He spent most of his time in the cell, staring at the walls, replaying the same images over and over in his mind. His sons, their innocent faces, the screams, the pleading eyes. And every time, it felt like his chest was being squeezed tighter, as if the very air around him was growing thinner. The lawyer came and went, but Chad wasn't listening anymore. He had no interest in what could be done to mitigate the punishment. No interest in what plea deals or defense strategies they could use. He had no more fight left in him. All that remained was the crushing weight of what he had done, and the knowledge that it could never be undone. The days bled into one another, each indistinguishable from the last, until the trial finally arrived. Chad was led into the courtroom in chains, his eyes scanning the room as he was escorted to the defendant's table. The buzz of the crowd, the murmur of voices, it all felt distant, like he was in a dream. His eyes found her, sitting across the room. His wife. Her face was pale, but her eyes were hard, unwavering. She didn't look at him. She didn't even seem to acknowledge his presence. She had already turned away, even before the trial had begun. And Chad felt something deep inside him shatter. The woman who had once been his partner, his love, she was a stranger now. Nothing would ever bring back the life they had once shared. His heart sank as the proceedings began. The prosecution laid out their case, every word cutting into him, each statement painting him as the monster he had become. The evidence was irrefutable. His actions were beyond justification. There were no words he could offer, no defense he could mount. All he could do was sit there, numb, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. The judge's gavel struck with finality, and the trial moved forward. The witnesses, the testimony, the cold, unrelenting truth of it all. Chad felt like he was drowning in it. And yet, it didn't matter, because in that moment he knew the verdict was already written in his mind. He had no chance of escaping what was coming. The courtroom seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating him in the weight of his own guilt. Finally, it was his turn to speak. But when the defense attorney called him to the stand, he didn't move. He didn't speak. What was there to say? What could he possibly offer that would change anything? The silence stretched. His lawyer urged him to speak, but Chad's voice was caught in his throat. He had no words left. Nothing could fix the devastation he had caused. The only thing he could feel was the overwhelming weight of his own shame and the deafening silence that now filled the courtroom. The gavel struck again, and it was time for the closing arguments. Chad barely registered the words being said around him. He was lost in the suffocating despair of his own making, and no one in that room could understand the agony he felt. Not even his wife. Not even himself. As the trial reached its conclusion, Chad knew nothing could bring back his sons, and nothing could undo the darkness he had unleashed. When the jury returned with the verdict, Chad's heart beat painfully in his chest.
Guilty.
The words echoed in his mind, and for a brief moment, the reality of it hit him harder than any physical blow. The weight of the words hung over him like a shadow, unrelenting and final. The punishment was coming. But even as the judge spoke, sentencing him to life without parole, Chad knew one thing for sure. He deserved far worse. The life he had once known, the family he had destroyed, were lost forever. And there was nothing left but the dark, suffocating loneliness of his prison cell. The weeks after the trial dragged on, each day indistinguishable from the last. Chad sat in his cell, the silence around him deeper than it had ever been before. The verdict had been delivered, and with it, the finality of his fate. Life without parole. No chance for redemption. No second chances. And yet, even with that sentence hanging over him, Chad felt as if the real punishment had already begun. The isolation gnawed at him. The emptiness inside him spread like a poison, slow and insidious, consuming whatever small remnants of hope or humanity he had left. He spent his days staring at the walls, the memories of that night haunting him at every turn. His sons. The faces of the two boys he had loved and destroyed. The faces of the innocent lives he had shattered with his own hands. They were with him always, the ghosts of his actions, and they wouldn't let him forget. Not for a second. The prison itself seemed to be closing in on him. The cold stone walls felt like they were pressing against his chest, the air thick and suffocating. The guards, the prisoners, he barely noticed them anymore. He was no longer a man to them. He was a shadow. A ghost walking the halls of his own torment. His wife had stopped visiting. She had already moved on, just as she had promised. Chad had no illusions about what had happened. She had made her choice, just as he had made his, and the consequences had been irreparable.
He wondered if she ever thought about him.
Would she ever look back and remember the man he had been before everything fell apart? Before the rage and the twisted logic had taken over? But he knew the answer. She had moved on. She had turned her back on him long before the trial. And now it was too late. Chad's thoughts drifted back to his sons. He could still see them so clearly when they were young, when they had trusted him, when they had looked to him for protection, for love. How had he let it come to this? How had he allowed his anger to consume him so completely? He had taken everything that mattered, and now he was left with nothing. The hours felt like days. The days felt like weeks. And through it all, Chad remained trapped in a world of his own making. A world where his actions could never be undone, where his sins were written in every corner of his existence. There was no escape from it, no redemption, and no way to erase the ghosts that haunted him. Some days, he would hear a distant noise from outside his cell, a laugh, a conversation, a sound that reminded him of the world he had lost. But those sounds were fleeting, like whispers in the wind. And Chad would return to his isolation, to the endless cycle of regret. But the guilt was always there. It never left. Every moment in that prison was a reminder of the lives he had taken, of the father, the husband, the man he had been. But in the end, none of it mattered. There was no turning back. And as the days crawled by, Chad realized with bitter clarity that the prison he had built for himself was more than just the concrete walls around him. The true prison was within him, and it would never let him go. Months passed, and Chad had become a fixture in his own misery. The prison had swallowed him whole, and every day felt like an endless repetition of the last. His soul, once vibrant with life, had withered into something unrecognizable. The other prisoners knew his story, whispered about him behind bars, but to them, he was just another lost soul, another broken man, condemned to live out his days in isolation. He couldn't escape the haunting visions of his sons. They were always there, their faces etched into his memory like a cruel reminder of the unspeakable act he had committed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their small hands reaching for him, their voices calling out in terror. He had been their protector, their father.
And now?
Now he was the one who had destroyed them. His wife's absence was a heavy weight on his chest. She had erased him from her life as though he had never existed. She had moved on, as she should have, but Chad couldn't escape the cold ache in his heart, the knowing that he had been the one to rip their family apart. Every inch of the life they had shared was gone, scattered to the winds by his own hands. Some nights, when the prison was still and the silence was unbearable, Chad would stare at the small window in his cell. He would strain to see beyond the bars, to glimpse the life that existed outside. But there was nothing for him out there. No one was waiting for him. No one cared. He was a ghost, trapped in a world of his own making. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Chad felt something different. It wasn't hope, it was something more visceral, something darker. He realized with cold clarity that this was his life now, and there was no escaping it. He had taken away everything good, and in return, he would never know peace again. The guilt, the loss, the isolation, it was his eternal punishment. There was no redemption left. Just the slow, painful unraveling of a man who had once had everything and now had nothing. Years passed, and the world outside continued on, oblivious to Chad's existence in the prison walls. The faces of his sons, once vivid and full of life, began to fade in his memory, replaced by the emptiness that had grown within him. He could no longer recall the sound of their laughter, the warmth of their embrace. Their names, once spoken with such love, now hung on his lips like a bitter poison. In the dim light of his cell, Chad sat, his hands trembling as they rested on his knees. His reflection in the small, cracked mirror on the wall stared back at him, a man broken beyond repair. The years had worn him down, his hair, now graying, his face, once strong and youthful, was lined with the marks of regret and sorrow. There had been moments, fleeting ones, when he had allowed himself to imagine a world where things had been different. A world where he had been the father he was supposed to be, where his sons were alive and his family whole. But that world was long gone, replaced by the haunting reality of what he had done. There was no undoing it, no escaping it. Chad knew that he would spend the rest of his life in this cell, not because of the walls that enclosed him, but because of the prison inside his own mind. It was a prison that no guard, no trial, no sentence could ever free him from. The bars that held him captive were invisible, woven into the very fabric of his guilt. And yet, even in this despair, a strange kind of peace settled within him. It wasn't forgiveness, for he knew he would never earn that. But it was acceptance. The truth had sunk in, heavy and unyielding. He had taken everything, and now he had nothing left. His punishment wasn't just the years behind bars. It was the slow, unrelenting suffocation of knowing that the man he had once been was lost forever. And so, Chad Doerman, the man who had murdered his sons, faded into the shadows of his own existence, an echo of a life that had once mattered, now extinguished by his own hand. The world moved on, and he remained a ghost, trapped in the prison of his own making, forever haunted by the faces of those he could never bring back.